everybody, and welcome back.
Okay, good. Thank you.
See if we can gather us together. My name is Kara Shaw. I'm a professor in the School of Environmental Studies here and the director of the Transformative Climate Action Certificate, and I'm just moderator for today. And I want to just remind us that we're gathered on Lekwungen territories where the Songhees and the Esquimalt and the Saanich nations have relationships that are ongoing, which is important, I think, just to call to our mind every once in a while as we're doing work together, as well as being appropriate protocol for the place. So we have a panel, 4 members on the panel here. We're going to go slightly out of order. Yvonne Wu's going to go first, Sue's going to go first, and then we're going to go according to the list. So Shane Youngster is going to be next, and then DeAndre Smiles and Julie MacArthur. They're each going to speak for about 15 minutes, hopefully. And then we'll hand it over to you for questions. So with that, I will hand it over to Yvonne to get us started.
Thank you. I hijacked the order because I'm actually going to take 2 of my minutes to roast Will, our host. I wrote this down. Okay, so first of all, who has Will on Twitter? Just put your hand up. Okay, keep your hand up if you know that Will loves to get himself involved in Twitter flame wars. Okay, and he likes to get blocked by conservatives. For those who don't follow him, please at Will W.J. Greaves, okay? And I like to say that at Will W.J. Greaves is his main job. He's just moonlighting as a professor and an expert on climate security. It's not over, guys. So imagine how Will felt when Elon Musk bought Twitter. He was like, oh my gosh, who is gonna listen to my brilliant rants that I spent so long crafting to make sure they meet the word count? Who? I know, a bunch of academics who I'm gonna apply for a grant and pay them to come here, and then I have a captive audience. And he loves having a platform so much, this Will, that he's doing all of this on his sabbatical. You're supposed to go like to a different country, maybe bring your family, have a good time. Will, no, stays at UVic and brings all these people together, listen to him. Anyway, so this is for Will, and in all seriousness, please give him a big round of applause, because he did do all this on his sabbatical. And then I had a joke I missed, but I'm just gonna say it because I wanted to say it. But I saw his notes, they were all tweets. Okay, now I'm gonna give my presentation, which is not gonna be as funny, sorry. All right, so I'm gonna talk about, I don't know how to transition from that. My name is Dr. Yvonne Su. I'm an assistant professor at York University. I look very young, and Jonas thought I was an undergrad. But here I am to present to you about climate change displacement in Canada. I'm being very cheeky with my title, saying Canadian climate refugees, fire and floods in our own backyard, because if you've been watching the news lately,
I think you have to push the down button. Are you trying to switch it? I think this
There-
happened before.
There you go. Okay. If you watch the news lately, all we're hearing about is concerns about influxes of asylum seekers, international students, immigrants, all of these people who are coming to our shores and, taking jobs, affordability crisis, living in our homes, etc. Right? And they're all seen as these foreigners. And if you listen to some of the CBC hosts and their power plays and those panels, there's this really uncomfortable vibe that's like, can we criminalize asylum seeking? Can we stop these asylum seekers from coming? And of course you'd have somebody being like, oh yeah, that's illegal, we can't do that, that's the whole point of being asylum seekers. So there's something about us really liking the fact, or really getting inflamed and upset when they're foreigners. And that plays really well, unfortunately, to many of these authors who are writing about climate refugees, but talking about them in a way of they're all coming from the global south and they want to come to the global north, and the global north is going to be overwhelmed by all these climate refugees. But of course that's not supported by empirical evidence on 2 points. One, there is more south to south migration happening in the world than south to north. That's just an empirical fact. And it's growing south to south. So it's not fair to even say that they all want to go to the global north, because that's not what's happening. And second of all, most of climate displacement, climate migration is happening internally, because it's very expensive to cross borders, and a lot of people don't want to cross borders. You cross borders, comes with a different language, comes with a different social capital. You're away from your friends. You might not even understand the culture that you're in. So people don't necessarily want to move. But we have these prominent articles, The Guardian, New York Times Magazine, talking about these movements, and Guy Vince has written a whole book on this. And I think it's not cool. It's not right? And we need to be looking at the evidence. But this is what's happening abroad and like a big focus and very sexy. What's not sexy is climate displacement migration in Canada. Nobody wants to talk about it. You know, we talk about these wildfires, we talk about these floods, but we don't really like to talk about what we can do for each other, for our neighbors in these communities, and we don't want to talk about the policy aspect, and of course, the government doesn't really have a plan. So Liz Linton, BC, Will, did a really good job talking about it and how it burned to the ground, it was one of the hottest days, the heat dome, etc. And many of us saw this, and there was a really poignant quote, actually in a YouTube comment that I caught, which was, and maybe they took it from somewhere else, but it was this idea that we're going to be looking at these videos until we are the ones filming these videos, right? And there is, Sean, one of your colleagues here at UVic, has a project called Climate Disaster Project, and he has over 200 testimonies of people who have experienced and survived disasters in Canada, whether it be a tornado or a flood or one of these wildfires, but everybody, it's touching more people than we know. And then, of course, unfortunately, climate change fuels wildfires, and wildfires fuel climate change. And that is a big concern going forward. Oh, let's get this. And then also, I think, again, in terms of numbers, we have the numbers. So almost 500,000 people have been internally displaced in the last 10 years in Canada. Yeah, I don't think these numbers make the news. Right? And we don't talk about what's happening with these people, how long have they been displaced, where have they gone, and what do we owe them, right? Unfortunately, in Canada, we call them evacuees. We don't actually call them displaced peoples, or really survivors. The policy term for them is evacuees, right? Just like us leaving this building if there was a fire alarm. It's temporary, it's not that serious, we come back. But many people are displaced for many years on end. Here's just a simple map. And then Indigenous communities are disproportionately impacted. So this is a very specific case study. So in 2011, the government diverted water as a flood threatened Winnipeg. That diverted water created a super flood in Lake St. Martin. Thus, what started as a natural hazard led to a human-made disaster. The super flood led to the evacuation of 18 First Nations communities and the permanent displacement of Lake St. Martin First Nations community. And the interesting thing is, this was, again, a human-made situation. They literally diverted a natural hazard. So guess what? They were held responsible. This is one of the biggest class action lawsuits and claims in Canada's history. In January 2022, a Manitoba Court of Queen's Bench ordered to approve a settlement agreement of $85.5 million for anyone who owned real or personal property off nearby Lake St. Martin First Nations and within 30-kilometer radius of the lake that was damaged by 2011 floods. This is unprecedented, but it's also important, right? Because these human decisions are contributing to these losses that have to be compensated. So this is, again, another photo from what happened. And I'm also just going to make you guys do a pop quiz. I'm sorry. So go here, please. I also have quizzes on online dating and tacos if you want, but we can do that later. Okay, so you go on that website, kahoot.it, and then you put in this code, which is loading. And don't worry, this is within my 15 minutes. And those online can join too, if there's still people online. So that's the PIN, 6905726. And there's fun music. I don't know if you could hear it. You guys can make up fake names in case you get all the answers wrong. I know academics don't like to be wrong. So sorry, I know you made a real name. John is sorry. Okay, let's go. The pin will stay, so people can keep adding themselves. This also tests how much you were listening to Will's presentation when he was talking about Lynn BC. Okay. What percentage of structures in Lytton were burnt down? 50, 90, 75, 100. Did someone just say the answer? Are we a bunch of academics cheating?
Thank you.
Changing the rules of the game.
I
This is
love
collaboration.
this. So it is 90, but that is hilarious. Stop shouting answers. 90% of the village burnt down, which is very serious.
How come I'm in 10th place when I got it right?
Too
There's
slow.
other people who
Okay,
got it
yes,
right.
yes.
Okay, what caused the fire? Climate change, the sea and rail trade, teenagers. Hard to say. I know, it's hard, right, guys? Okay, so I said hard to say because there's actually a lawsuit against CN Rail for running their train the hottest day in the summer and potentially sparking a fire. So they don't know, they're still investigating, but they're saying that's one of the causes. Of course, climate change plays a big role, like Will had said, and yeah, teenagers were unfortunately not involved. Sorry, guys. All right. How much are rebuilding costs estimated at? 10 million, 50 million, 75 million, 100 million. $100 million. It's a lot of money. The government doesn't want to give. Okay, fourth question, second last question. 2 years on, how much of Lytton has been rebuilt? 2 years on. 0, 10, 25, 50. Zero. When I asked this question without the PowerPoint, everybody's like, oh yeah, okay, makes sense, totally. Obviously not. You guys didn't get it, right? Because people think that recovering and like building and all these things happen quickly and there's priority and your house burnt down. But no, there's a lot of things in the way. And again, the government doesn't want to pay, like excavation, taking away the dirt, right? And now, unfortunately, or I don't know if that's the wrong word, but they did find burial grounds. So now there's an extensive amount of money that has to go into archaeological research to make sure that those aren't disturbed, right? Another barrier. And people actually protested. The villagers went back and they protested because they're like, F this, we want our homes, why is it taking so long? All right, last question, let me see who the winner is. Which is one of the biggest barriers to real building? Fighting over planning, government inaction, insurance, safety. Insurance. Only 3 people got it right. Who are those 3 people? Good job, good job. Good job. Yeah, it's a trick question because nobody would think insurance, but it is definitely insurance. I'm not an insurance expert, so don't ask me questions about insurance, but I will tell you that what we don't think about is that the insurance companies only want to pay for what you previously had. They don't want to pay for what you want to have. So while a lot of people are saying, well, like, can we have fire-safe homes? Can we have fire-safe doors? Like, can we build a more resilient home? They're like, no, 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 no. We're only going to make you, build you, give you what you previously had. So that's a big frustration. And again, this is the Insurance Bureau of Canada. Insurance puts back the building you had, not the building you want. But this is really frustrating, right? Because people don't, their house had burnt down, and Lytton, BC had another wildfire just a year after, right? So they want to be more resilient, but there's no funds, there's no policies, there's no framework for that. Thanks. And yeah, I'll be done, don't worry. And so that's the issue. So maybe we can think about perhaps there could be some government scheme where they make up the difference. 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, so people can have insurance plus the house that they want. And also, are they building back better or building back bitter? Right? A lot of burnt out residents are really upset about the discussions. For example, one thing that made the media was a discussion over solar panel sidewalks. Like, we don't want solar panel sidewalks, we just want our homes back. right? So that's a big divide happening. You got people who want to build the ideal village and people who just want to move back in. And then these questions of whose experience matters, whose future matters, how do you balance fire resiliency and fireproofing communities with survivors' needs to be housed and return home, who pays and for what, and who decides? I don't answer any of those. Don't ask me. Proactive solutions, community-based planned relocation. Let's talk about this. We know where the hot zones are, the hot spots. We know the places that are vulnerable and that have been hit time and time again. So let's be proactive and potentially move them. Develop multi-year, multi-hazard prevention plans that move beyond party politics. Will covered all of that. Developing multi-level governance and resources. So all the different levels have to work together, right? Not just one. And then interestingly, support and prepare host communities. So that's one thing that gets overlooked completely, is that, Kamloops was overwhelmed and the mayor actually declared a state of emergency because they couldn't deal with all people moving. Again, we know these things are coming. Why can't we give these mayors and these communities resources so that when their neighbors come from fires and their homes have burned, they're received with open arms and not hostility? And I'm done. Thank you. Shame.
Great. And it's down arrow? Is that right?
So,
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, well, I want to start like other people have by thanking Will. I'm not going to make fun of you. That was already done. But thanks, Will and Sarah and Ali, for their generous invitation to be part of this event. I actually did my undergrad here at UVic way back when. The place looked quite a bit different, but still has a lovely charm, so it's great to come back. Over the last few years, make sure this works. So one of my research priorities has been exploring the intersection of populism and communication about climate and energy. And that's what I've been asked to talk about today. I'm going to be pulling material from a few different papers and projects. So I'll be moving through things fairly quickly, but I'm obviously happy to dig into any more details in the Q&A. This is also a fairly visually intense presentation, so if you want to get closer, you could actually see what's on the slides. But that invitation will probably have about the same effect as it does when I invite my students to come closer. So thanks for... Oh, there we go. Thank you, Michael. So that, there you go. Living up to the student.
down in front.
So the core narrative of conservative populism that hypocritical liberal elites have wormed their way into institutions of media and government and are using that power to impose their radical political agenda on the rest of us, well, clearly that storyline is a pretty good fit for those seeking to block and delay action around climate. But many of the most important ways that populism works to block climate action in this country have not involved a focus upon climate change, as in many other places, but instead works by centering energy. Tracking discourse around climate and energy in our media over the past decade, which is what I've been doing, the iconic Canadian phrase, two solitudes, comes to mind, as emblematic of how often these two spheres that are so deeply entangled in their material relations have remained so separate in how they are represented in news, politics, and social media. Now, as you know, the oil and gas sector, not only the largest source of emissions in Canada, but also the fastest growing source by a wide margin over the last couple of decades. Certainly the principal reason why our track record on emissions reduction is so much worse than other industrialized countries. But in analysis that I did of the last federal election, hailed by some as Canada's first climate election, our media and most of our politicians were almost entirely silent on how to deal with this very largest of elephants in the room. Imagine, this is the analogy I used to think about, imagine a dieting program where the objective of cutting calories was entirely divorced from any realistic sense of where those calories were actually coming from. That's what media coverage of climate all too often looks like in Canada. Now, there are lots of reasons for that, but the one that I want to spend some time with this afternoon is the power and prevalence of extractive populism. Initially honed in the pipeline wars around Northern Gateway, TMX, Energy East, extractive populism tells a story about Canada anchored by three core claims or arguments. First claim, extractivism, the extraction and export of resources such as oil and fossil gas, constitutes the core of the Canadian economy and provides a wide range of benefits to everyone in the country. A robust and healthy extractive sector is positioned as a public good, generating high-paying jobs for workers, opportunities for business, revenues for government, and paying for generous public services. Now, the most important rhetorical move here is what I describe as symbolic nationalization. In the 1970s, the Liberal government of the day implemented the National Energy Program, a very, very mild form of nationalization that was bitterly opposed by the fossil fuel industry, the Alberta government, and some people in Alberta, although not as many as you might think. Anybody remember that? Let the eastern bastards freeze in the dark. Now, while the oil and gas sector hated the prospect that real nationalization might jeopardize their profit margins, might jeopardize a corporate-driven development model, they realized that symbolic forms of nationalization were a very powerful tool to legitimate the tar sands for publics outside of Alberta. And so Canadians have been subjected to a decades-long flood of advertising, news, PR, social media that essentially represent the oil and gas sector as if it had been nationalized, as if it were a public enterprise designed to serve the common good. So wrapped in the flag, the capitalist logic of an industry that instinctively puts the profits of primarily global shareholders ahead of the public good recedes from view. Now, in recent years, claims about economic benefits have been supplemented with an endless flow of reminders that the edifice of modern civilization rests upon the miracle, the miraculous and myriad contributions that fossil fuels provide our society. And of course, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the argument that Canada's oil and fossil gas is ethical, which was originally pioneered by Rebel News founder Ezra Levant, has been supercharged, essentially positioning our extractive sector as a force for global justice and democracy. Second claim, extractivism is under attack, threatened by a small but highly vocal and surprisingly powerful constellation of political forces. Now, in its early days, enemy number one for extractive populism was environmentalists, the environmental movement, whom, as you may recall, Natural Resources Minister, or former Natural Resources Minister, Joe Oliver infamously slandered as foreign-funded radicals who threatened the prosperity and well-being of all Canadians, and whom D-list, I would say, Canadian celebrity W. Brett Wilson argued more than once should be hung as traitors. In research that we did on social media a few years ago, we found the demonization of opponents to be one of the most prevalent themes in communication of industry supporter groups. Now today, as was referenced in the previous discussion, it's unequivocally our Prime Minister that has become the principal target of a truly visceral hatred that to many of us, I think, represents a shocking departure from the norms of civility that have tended to prevail, for the most part, in Canadian political discourse. But this hatred really isn't all that shocking if you spend any time in the darker corners of social media, where the most fervent exponents of extractive populism, they marinate in a toxic brew of conspiracy theories, outrage at the betrayal, the alleged betrayal of Canada, and often violent fantasies of revenge and retribution. One of the most shocking things that I came across in my own research occurred in the immediate aftermath of Greenpeace protest in 2018. A couple of activists climbed on a drilling rig to stop its shipment to a pipeline site for a few hours, then they posted about it on Facebook. Pretty run-of-the-mill environmental activism. Over the next 24 hours, their Facebook page was swarmed by hundreds, perhaps thousands, of angry pipeline supporters who unleashed a barrage of hatred. And a good chunk of this was likely driven by Robbie Picard, who runs, let me get the right slide up there, who runs Oil Sands Strong, one of the most prominent industry supporter groups. A little more than an hour after the original post, he posted on his page, sharing it with his 300,000 followers, and urged them, go and harass the activists. And they did, filling up the activist pages with waves of hate that fantasized about all kinds of violent responses, including lots of references to snipers. And all of it coming from users who, when you rolled over their comments and you saw their profiles, looked like pretty normal Canadians, but who seemingly have no qualms about openly fantasizing about killing environmentalists. Now, this exercise in performative dehumanization, not only repulsive, but I think terrifying as a testament to where the demonization of political enemies can lead. And as reporting from the front lines of Indigenous opposition to the Coastal GasLink pipeline suggests, these sentiments are not always confined to a radical fringe. Third claim, that collective political mobilization is necessary to defend extractivism from those sinister forces both inside the country and outside that threaten it. About a decade ago, groups like CAP figured out that in addition to using their traditional tools of corporate power, backdoor lobbying, influence over commercial media, big budget ad campaigns, they also needed to build their own movement. And so they turned to aggressively mobilizing those constituencies most likely to support their agenda, so industry workers, resource-dependent communities, people with a conservative worldview. And the vocabulary and the narrative and the images of movement building used by industry and supporters, it really is striking if you spend any time with this communication. And as Simon Enoch argued in this really great piece from Briarpatch, if you haven't seen it, it isn't too difficult to trace the narrative, the emotional, the organizational pathways that led from early efforts to mobilize in favor of pipelines and LNG to the abortive Yellow Vests protests and finally to the so-called Freedom Convoy. Now, in the few minutes I have left, I want to shift from the core messages of extractive populism to who's actually delivering these messages. Who are the key Canadian players that are pushing these storylines on social media? So these slides are from a talk that I did with some colleagues for the Center for Hate, Bias, and Extremism. And essentially it involved updating some earlier network mapping to identify which groups on Facebook are getting the most traction around these 8 key words that feature prominently in discourse around climate and energy politics. So this data set's based on a year's worth of Facebook posts between August 2022 and August 2023. So this chart, and I know that's probably hard to read for those in the back of the room, it shows the top 20 Canadian pages getting the most engagement around those 8 keywords. And if you scan that list of groups along the bottom, first thing that probably jumps out at you is they're all right-wing, or a lot of them are right-wing. Most of the top groups are right-wing on this, and there's very few progressive organizations getting any traction on social media around these issues. Welcome to Facebook in Canada. So 14 of the top 20 are right-wing pages. We have politicians. We have industry supporter groups. We have what I call populist outrage machines that use meme wars to whip up resentment against liberal elites and policies. And last but definitely not least, we have far-right media, which have proven remarkably effective, at least until Facebook stopped all Canadian news media. But they had proved remarkably effective in using social media platforms to build their audiences. And here's an example of that. This chart shows how True North, which is probably the leading source now, many of you may not have heard of them, but they're one of the leading sources now, they were regularly attracting comparable levels of engagement to CBC and CTV on Facebook, and much more than the Toronto Star, Globe and Mail. And left alternative media are basically invisible compared to them. So that's who is driving the conversation around these keywords on Facebook. So here are those 14 pages. A little different visually so you can get a sense of who they are, organized around this taxonomy: politicians, industry groups, outrage machines, far-right media. There's a few that didn't crack the top 10, so I just sort of added them. Oil Sands Strong, that's Robbie Picard's group that drove that misogynistic attack on those activists. 3 additional pages from the Canada Strong and Proud network, which is distinct from Ontario Proud. It's really hard to keep track of all the Prouds. It's like a People's Front of Judea sort of thing, conservative version of that. Friends of Science, who of course are anything but, Western Standard, and then a few conservative activists who were getting a lot of engagement. So these are the key players that are really pushing this discourse on Facebook. And finally, and this will probably not make sense to any of you at the back, this is a network map, a basic network map, visualizing the interactions between these groups and the pages that they send traffic to. I'm just going to finish with one quick point on this. talk of populism on social media, it often dwells on disinformation, extremism, the toxic content of these networks, things I've talked about today. There's lots and lots of that that's going on out there. Underlying message here was that having elected MPs who stand up for your interests and values is something worth celebrating, worth sharing with your social networks, and worth organizing to support. There is, in other words, a kind of conservative sociological imagination at work here. That is, there's a political narrative that not only pins the affordability crisis on global elites and climate policies like the carbon tax, but positions mainstream forms of organizing, of civic engagement, of electoral mobilization as the best means of implementing a far-right political agenda. The ideas and the claims of extractive populism continue, I think, to anchor those narratives in important and interesting ways, and I think it raises the stakes of developing counter-narratives. I would argue for a kind of Canadian left populism, but that's a whole other talk, so I'm going to leave it there. Thank you. Hopefully I didn't go too far.
Oh, that would be amazing. Thank you. Hi all. I'm from Royal Roads University. My name's Julie MacArthur. Before mine goes up, I just have to reflect on something there. I was just interviewing Catherine McKenna not so long ago. So for those of you who aren't Canadian, she was the former Environment and Climate Change Minister. And I was just thinking about that most recent presentation. And she was termed Climate Barbie, for example. She had a security detail have to follow her because of the really outrageous personal threats and misogynist attacks. And so as I was reading that, a lot of my presentation is going to pivot a little bit, but it's going to be about the same issue around backlash, the backlash to addressing the climate crisis. And I'm going to start from a place of personalizing it as well. Thank you so much. And as I was interviewing her, it was so fascinating because she didn't really want to focus on that side of things. But there were so many elements, I think, that are really important. One is the gender dimension that some of this backlash takes that we haven't really talked too much about in this room so far today, but it kind of popped up in a few different places that I think is interesting. The other side of it, though, is about the importance of humanizing. And I think when I was invited to this, we didn't really have to propose particular topics or anything like that. So I was just going off the title of our panel around the justice and the kind of social dimensions of security. And I started out in my master's looking at human security as a particular issue, and I haven't really returned to it for about 20 years or so. But I do think that the human security element is where I kind of want to connect into the broader theme of the conference. And most of my work today focuses on, not just today, but these days, focuses on energy transitions and particularly engaging the grassroots actors. And bottom-up climate movements and different ways of engaging them and democratizing the energy transition. Because Will was talking about, climate security and the need, maybe, or looking at why Canada doesn't focus more on climate security. And my initial question, which actually came up in the conversation, was, would we want it to? And I think the securitization of energy transitions in particular could open up some opportunities, but only constituted in very particular ways. It could really also do a lot of closing down. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. But I wanted to start with how so my interventions on the energy aspects and energy transition aspects of the climate problematic and looking through the lens of human energy security with a particular focus on democratization. Now, part of the issue there is that a lot of the literature talks about how elite-led, technocratic, and exclusive energy transitions are really problematic for effectiveness, and they're also really problematic from a normative standpoint around justice and rights. And Peter Newell wrote an excellent piece on the global political economy of energy transitions, and he says how to transition to a zero carbon economy in a timely and fair fashion is one of the greatest challenges, as I think we all recognize in this room, but it requires a power shift away from the beneficiaries of a high carbon economy, these incumbent interests, towards a disparate set of actors at the front line of climate change. You know, those personal, the actual, you don't have to call it local, but communities, real people in real places. Not that those other actors aren't also real people enmeshed in real places, but I think the geographies of this and the political economy are something we haven't talked a ton about, but I do think it's important. And he talks about how the scale of the needed shift across regions, sectors, and actors is without historical precedent. So the justice dimensions around climate action, and particularly energy transition, are really front and center. And Mary Robinson, she talks about how this shift to a justice dimension in our climate problematic framing is one from shifting from talking about the greenhouse gases and melting ice caps, it's late, into a civil rights movement with people and communities and the most vulnerable at the center. And I think this is crucial. But I did want to focus, as I said, on maybe more of the personal. So much like in the last panel, the wildfire season last year, for those of you who weren't in Canada, but I think most of us are based in North America, was so shocking. I used to live in New Zealand, and when that wildfire season happened in Australia, similarly, that was incredible. But for me, the personal connection is that the climate change issues are not just out there, but they're very much here. And they're not anymore. I think for most people in a room like this, about the them, it's also about the us. Not that it being about us is the only reason to take action, but I think that's really important. For example, my brother lives in Fort Nelson, up in northern British Columbia, near where the Donny Creek wildfire is. The Donny Creek wildfire was the size of Prince Edward Island, an entire province. 5,745 square kilometers. I don't want to spend too much more time on it, but for those of you who are talking about novels today who haven't read John Vaillant's Fire Weather, it's very powerful when it talks about the Fort McMurray 2016 wildfire. And he says, that time, every time some unprecedented climate event floors us, the 21st century says, oh yeah, think that was something? Here, hold my beer. It seems that we're really feeling the intensity in a way that I remember 2 decades ago writing about this intensification of floods and fires and whatnot, and it is really coming home. He talks about in that Fort McMurray wildfire, neighborhoods once distinguished by tidy uniformity, transforming into suburban hells rendered by Salvador Dali. Household fixtures melted and writhed into monstrous forms, gas stations exploding, cars and propane tanks affixed to grills were no more than flying shrapnel. At the same time, he also talks about the tragic incongruities as people deal with the displacement and the shock of these events. So the owner of a dry cleaning store shrieked, get out, on the phone to his wife, and then turned to a client and asked if she could pick up her garments on Tuesday. So the reason I highlight some of this is to bring these big, dramatic, shocking events that are from a physical climate sense that into the kind of human and lived perspectives of people sitting in the middle of that. And for those of you working in a security field day in and day out, that might not be too shocking. But I do think that turning to literature, not just social media, but there is this element of bringing it back home to us and to people like us. And I think that's important. For those of you who haven't read Fire Weather, he's an excellent writer, so I highly recommend it. Now, in my presentation and in a lot of my work, one of the things and why I really emphasize the importance of looking for non-traditional actors and spaces to help address the kind of energy transition we need is because we have seen for decades now this lack of action and this big puzzle that kind of comes up around why aren't we getting it? Well, there are the usual suspects, the incumbent interests, the organized fossil fuels, the astroturfing of organizations. There's a lot of that, but we also see these gaps. So what you can't see on this particular image is the gap between where we need to go in terms of reducing emissions of 1.5 and 2, the promises related to the nationally determined contributions, and then even from that, the conditional promises. Now, two things really, really stand out to me. One, the incredible lack of ambition, and beyond that lack of ambition, which a lot of people attribute to political will, but that is such a fuzzy term, right? Who? Are we talking about the national actors? Of course, we heard about this earlier. People often talk about the need for there to be more support in terms of climate policy, but some of the largest surveys globally of people's perception around the need for climate action show that the vast majority of people in the vast majority of countries are actually very supportive. Now, where there's a lot of tension is when we get to specific industries, specific geographies, specific policies. And so I think it's important to unpack some of that a little bit. But the other point I think that these gap reporting graphs are handy is because they also show not just ambition gaps, but implementation gaps. Really significant ones. And I don't think it's just about that federal provincial dimension. I do think it's why we need to start talking about actual people in actual places, you know, where your garbage gets picked up, where you take your kids to school, where your everyday life takes place. And the reason I think that's so important is because it addresses some of these issues around the agonism of politics. The fact that these pressures from the wildfires and the flooding and the dramatic events, as well as the pressures around our lack of action for decades, I think push people to want to securitize climate change and with that energy transitions. And I understand that response. At the same time, I think there's a real danger in doing that, because by putting it into the realm of something we have to do now, we have to do fast, I think there's a risk of doing it in a way that's authoritarian. I think there's a risk of doing that in a way that shuts out the exact people who are now not all for the same reasons, but breaking apart at the seams in terms of their trust in government, in scientists, in authority figures. And this isn't just from the political right, it's also from the political left. And I think that last comment that you made is a really important one. And one of the places historically we look to try to bridge some of these barriers, not that local spaces are any sort of panacea, but in that the people that you interact with when you're taking your kids to school or on playgrounds or at churches, this community municipal level, not only by itself, but is one of the places where we can start to see some change. Also think this area is particularly interesting because securitization, as I said, can be disabling. In some ways, a shift to renewables by securitizing it, by thrusting it up as something essential and important, we have to do this, sometimes renewables are portrayed as unstable, unreliable, progenitors of energy shortages, including total blackouts. So these narratives, right, of we can't afford to shift to renewables, we can't afford to do an energy transition because energy systems are too essential. So there's almost this kind of conservative element that can align with that securitization. It's too important to change things, to risk on some of these new technologies. On the other hand, Kasper Suzdecki's done a really interesting article on the relationship between energy securitization and democracy. And he says that, especially with a human security frame, thinking about communities and individuals and the security of them, not only to have access to being able to turn on their lights, but access in terms of affordability, access in terms of acceptable risks, access in terms of health and welfare and other elements of their livelihoods, that if the securitization is this broader human security coupled with a commitment to democratization, that can actually open up spaces where you get the benefits of this is extremely important without the disabling effects on the other side. Sorry. So I think for me, that was important when I thought about making any sort of contribution to this, that there is an importance in highlighting the difference, for example, between the enabling and disabling effects, and that focus on opening up spaces to new non-traditional actors and thinking of this in that more holistic sense of different elements. So the health that we talked about earlier, as well as things around energy poverty and affordability is where there is potential in this area. So a lot of the discourses that most of you may be familiar with have to do with climate and energy justice. And with this, what we're looking at is not just, are we going to put up a solar farm and is that going to be better, but questions around who owns it? Where do the benefits go? Are there direct benefits to the people where the technologies are going to be going? The discourses on climate and energy justice in particular also focuses on the racialized effects of energy infrastructures that have taken place historically. And in Canada, obviously, there's the deeply colonial implications of where waste is sited, let's say, from nuclear facilities or whatnot. This does not get erased when we make a shift to new green technologies. I think that there is often, and I think for very good reasons, concern around new green technologies being appropriated by the usual suspects, by incumbent energy industries adding them on top of their existing fossil fuel assets, rather than any big and deep replacement. I started to get quite depressed with some of this as I was studying things. I went too far, sorry. As I've been studying this over the last while, and so I started looking at where we see the potential for actors to bridge across political divides, where we see potential in institutional innovations. So how are we seeing technologies emplaced in someone's backyard that does not provoke them to reject it? Where do people see themselves in these technologies? And so a lot of my focus recently in Canada has been studying the emergence and development of renewable electricity cooperatives and social enterprises who are trying to ensure that the people proximate to the technology financially benefit from it, but more than that, actually have decision-making power in the siting and design of that. And this is a radically different way of thinking about rolling out renewable energy transitions than one that is decided in boardrooms from an investor-owned utility far away from where those people are. And I think this is one place where you start to see actual potential synergies between the discourses of green jobs, but then the actually that political will gap that has been sitting there, because a lot of people don't trust that any just transition is actually going to take place. They need to hear it through their neighbors. They need to hear it through their community knowledge networks, is what the literature talks about this at. So we've already talked about this in Canada. You can't see it, but essentially it's province by province, looking at what's been happening at an energy emissions level. And essentially it's the same story we've already had, that Alberta and Saskatchewan are just so radically different than a lot of the other provinces and going in the other direction. So I'm not going to waste time there. These are some pictures that might be interesting, but essentially what they're illustrating is that a lot of the International Energy Agency, major other kind of players in this area have been talking about what I am, the importance of having people-centered energy transitions, inclusive energy policies, but much like there's an implementation gap between climate policies and climate action, there's a huge knowledge gap here around what that means. What are inclusive energy policies? Who are we including? How would we do that? In the Canadian space, often policymakers will ask for, well, what does that look like? So it could be something like citizens' juries, and here I'm taking up Jose's call from this morning to say academics maybe need to be a little bit more prescriptive about what these innovations could look like. One of the pictures here was Ontario brought in a Green Energy and Economy Act, and within that had a feeder, like extra payments for community-owned power generation. And this spurred the largest development of renewable cooperatives, community-owned energy in the country. It also spurred a backlash, but the backlash, interestingly, was not to the community aspect, it was to the increase of energy prices and the ownership by foreign-owned companies, and then spurred a trade challenge and all sorts of other things. So some of the pictures here are illustrating some of the local backlash to particular projects and policies that I was talking about before, but usually a lot of it has to do with fear of other, anger over where the profits are going, and it isn't, interestingly, in research I've seen recently in the US and Canada, like in Alberta in particular, there was a really interesting study by a colleague of mine at the U of A, and landowners there are very keen to invest in and develop these new technologies, in some ways out of step, and it didn't depend on their political allegiance either. So some of these questions about, you know, how much ideology is driving some of these preferences shift based on the policy they're being asked the questions about, right? And again, this issue of personal interest, whether it be economic interest or participatory control, sometimes shifts some of these things. So I know I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to highlight the idea around including people and having things be more people-centered. This is the International Energy Global Energy Outlook. They're talking about they're essential to allow the vulnerable communities to manage the upfront costs. And these reports are starting to also acknowledge from a more instrumental perspective how community level, not just in Canada in terms of Indigenous sovereignty and ownership, but also in terms of urban infrastructure plans, the need to develop billions of dollars of new grid lines that are going to go through actual communities and places. These are being delayed and slowed, and to Will's points earlier, costing huge amounts of money. This isn't the climate side of this. This is the stuff we need to be doing. So without squaring the circle, for lack of a better term for it, we're not going to get anywhere near where we want to go. And that's not even dealing with the more mobilized climate opposition. So the literature on energy democratization talks about not just about moving from distant and private ownership and governance systems into more local and collective and proximate. And not local solely, but enmeshed. So thinking about Ostrom's work, but also those on polycentric governance. So the most powerful projects I've studied internationally in this area that democratize, open up energy infrastructures to new actors, like charging stations and solar, offshore wind, all of these different sorts of things. Maori own geothermal in New Zealand. They're usually partnerships between public municipal actors and utilities and community-owned cooperatives with investment from a range of other social movement actors. So this is about national network building. I have one more slide and then I will be done. So a lot of this recent research I'm doing on cooperatives is trying to understand in the Canadian context how the different provincial variation affects the development and ability of these kinds of actors to work around the vagaries of provincial politics and do what they want. And there's a ton of activity, interestingly, in Alberta because people at the grassroots are trying to develop climate action in spite of their government rather than with it, which I think is quite interesting. So yes, last year with the SHIRK project, the Community Energy Cooperatives Canada was formed. So it is the first ever national energy cooperative organization in Canada that is looking to do more movement building, policy advocacy and whatnot. So there's a lot more activity in this space internationally than people might look. So my main points for today, so this particular piece is called Follow the Leaders, and it's by Isaac Cordall in Berlin. But I think it's important because it goes back to the humanity. What we don't want, right, is a bunch of demographically homogeneous people sitting as the waters are rising around them, right? But I do think it's really important to get the focus off of just that, I think some people used to call this politicians discussing global warming. That shift between the talking and planning and action. We're hearing a lot more noises about opening up sectors and involving people in consulting, but often it just erodes that trust again because it's done in such a thin way, because there's not a lot of courage around really shifting ownership and power. So thank you for your attention. We can take questions.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, or I guess it is almost evening. My name is Neo Kamigabo DeAndre Smiles. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Geography here at UVic, as I'm also the head of the Geographic Indigenous Futures Lab here. I really enjoyed listening to my fellow presenters. I have a few funny Twitter stories that I can tell after the talk. Similarly to Will, I used to be a bit of a firebrand on Twitter, and then I kind of, when Elon Musk took over and turned it into, I think they call it X now, I decided that now my mental health is maybe a little bit more important than to fight with the same 10 Canadian right-wing trolls that seem to alternate through kind of different handles and things like that. So so I'm going to talk about kind of the idea of sovereignty in an area that is considered to be of vital importance in the world today, which is the Arctic. You're going to get a bit of a sneak preview of what students in my political and economic geographies course here at UVic will hear about here in about 3 weeks when we talk about kind of this idea of contested sovereignties in the North and what this means in the climate crisis, or the fancy academic word that we have to use for it, the Anthropocene. So looking forward to chat. I'll start out with a little bit of kind of a funny story, though. You might be asking, well, why is there a picture of people raising a Canadian flag and then people raising the Danish flag? Well, Canada has had a long history of having geopolitical interests in the North in both serious and both humorous kind of circumstances. Oh, there we go. So this little piece of rock here is Hans Island, which is located up in the north in the Arctic archipelago. And it was home to probably one of the most peaceful wars that a nation has ever engaged in, and that war was called the Whiskey War between Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark. So this island happens to lie in between Canadian claimed territories and Danish claimed territories as part of Kalaalleq Nunaat, or Greenland. And the border happened to run right through the middle of the island. And the Canadian government and the Danish government kind of had a debate over, well, who gets to claim Hans Island? And so there was kind of these interesting demonstrations of sovereignty over Hans Island. In 1984, a contingent of Canadian soldiers came onto Hans Island and planted a Canadian flag and left a bottle of Canadian whiskey on the island. Later that year, a Danish governmental official went onto Hans Island and put up the Danish flag and left a bottle of Danish schnapps on the island. And this went back and forth for some time. Finally, in 2023, the Danish government approved a negotiated settlement between the government of Canada and the Danish government that put a boundary right down the middle of Hans Island. And so when people, one of the trick questions I ask my students in political and economic geography is I say, how many countries does Canada have land borders with? And they say, well, of course, Dr. Smiles, one, the United States. And I say, well, we have two. We have a border with the United States, of course, and we have a land border with Denmark right down the middle of this island. But in all seriousness, right, the Arctic has had and the North has had a interesting pull on the collective psyche of Canadians as well as of Americans, which I'm from the United States originally. It's almost viewed as a bit of a frontier, right? When we think about the Arctic, we think about it being cold, much colder than here in BC right now. We think about a lot of snow, we think about ice, we think about the ocean. And we think about it as kind of a bit of a desolate wasteland, right? Or at least that's kind of the attitude that comes through in kind of broader public consciousness. Well, in actuality, the Arctic is, again, a zone that is viewed, a geographical area that is viewed as something that is extremely important and probably one of the, probably the most geopolitically important areas for a number of countries here in the 21st century. Who are these countries that view the Arctic as an important space? Well, I wish I had a more creative name for them, right? But we call them the Arctic states, right? The Arctic states are countries that directly border the Arctic Ocean or have territories north of the Arctic Circle, right? Countries that are commonly considered Arctic states, of course, we include Canada, the United States, Russia, Denmark through Kalaalleq Nunaat, Iceland, Sweden, Norway, Finland. But there are also a number of other nations that are increasingly becoming interested in the Arctic as well. Now, We are at a climate conference, of course, so you might be asking, well, what does this have to do with climate change? Well, the reason why the Arctic is becoming viewed as more and more important to these countries and more is because of the increasing level of melt of Arctic sea ice. As we can tell here from this graphic here, from 1978 until 2016, we have seen the gradual melting of the Arctic kind of ice cap at an astronomical kind of level, right? Not to be hyperbolic with my words, but this is an extreme amount of sea ice melt that we are looking at here. In countries, as the Arctic increasingly loses its ice cover, are beginning to see more and more opportunities become available to them. These opportunities or these benefits of the Arctic include things such as increased access to deposits of oil and natural gas. For example, the Arctic contains supplies about 10% of the world's oil currently, as well as a quarter of all natural gas supplies on Earth. And that's just the deposits that we have discovered, right? It is estimated that there could still be 20% of oil and natural gas deposits yet to be discovered. This makes it a lot easier to navigate across longer distances. One of the most common things when I talk to my students is when I try to point out, well, if I wanted to jump on a plane and fly to, say, Dublin, as I'll be doing in August for a conference, right? Which way do I go? And they say, well, wouldn't you fly east? And I was like, well, that would take a long time, right? You actually fly north over the top of the globe because that is the shortest distance. The Arctic, by losing its sea ice cover, it provides easier navigation for ocean-going vessels to be able to move across between continents fairly easily. And it is also a strategic location geopolitically for military forces. Let's get a little bit further into some of the geopolitics of kind of these natural resources. So part of this kind of increased interest in the Arctic comes through the geopolitics of oil. So one of the major players, the major player in kind of oil production in the world today is OPEC, right? The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which is a grouping of countries that produce and export petroleum and oil. They have major inputs, right, in setting prices among other factors that influence prices, but they basically are able to set prices about how much, on the oil that they produce and export, and that can influence the price of oil and sometimes downstream, right, gasoline and other products worldwide. Oil embargoes that have been carried out by OPEC and other shortages in history, such as the oil embargo in 1973 surrounding the Arab-Israeli war that year, the 1979 oil crisis due to the Iranian Revolution, and more recent spikes in oil costs and fuel costs have driven desires to become more independent in oil production and consumption in places like Canada. Kind of the idea about how can we find sources of oil that we're not beholden to a foreign power in order to get access to. The geopolitics of natural gas follow similar patterns, right? Some of the top producers in the world today of natural gas include the United States, Russia, Iran, Qatar, China, and Canada. Natural gas is still used in many places as a heating source as well as a fuel source, right? Maybe not as much. I live in an apartment in James Bay that we have electrical heat, right? But back home in Minnesota where I'm from, people still use fuel oil. They use natural gas to power their homes or power their furnaces. This is particularly subject to geopolitical pressures, right, such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine and pressure towards other countries, including the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline. This drives up the demand for independent or more locally controlled sources of natural gas, as we've seen in Europe, which has pivoted away from Russian-controlled natural gas and trying to find sources within Europe as well as in the Middle East. These geopolitics also extend to the geopolitics of mineral and resource wealth. The Arctic is considered one of the last resource frontiers, containing deposits of minerals and resources such as coal, zinc, iron ore, and other rare earth resources that are desired by countries today. This also includes more natural resources such as fisheries that have become accessible due to increasing climate change in the Arctic region. All of this means there's an increased possibility for increased domestic production and extraction and more benefit to the Canadian economy. As a geographer, of course, we have to talk about space and place, and so part of this comes down to the idea of boundaries or the lack thereof, right, through exclusive economic zones and some of these friction points of sovereignty in the north. And so an exclusive economic zone is defined as an area of the sea where a country has exclusive rights to exploit resources such as natural resources, energy resources, etc., This can really range in size depending on the country and kind of their approach to it. They can range from 12 nautical miles up to 200 nautical miles away from the shoreline. This is different than territorial waters, right? Territorial waters are waters that are directly adjacent to the shoreline of a country where that country has uncontested sovereignty. The exclusive economic zone is more of a fuzzy area where the country kind of claims the ability to exploit the economic resources in that zone. In areas like the Arctic, where land masses between countries are sometimes a lot closer than 200 nautical miles from each other, what does this mean for national sovereignty and the rights to resource extraction? And what does it mean for international waters that might fall outside of these exclusive economic zones? Well, this is a source of, this has been long a source of contestation, right? This is not a new phenomenon, this kind of fascination with the North and extending control over it. This dates back to the history of the Northwest Passage, right? The Northwest Passage was held up historically as a way for ocean-going ships to get around the American landmass from Europe and other locales without having to sail all the way around South America and transiting Cape Horn, which is an extremely rough stretch of water, and took up more time, right? And even back then, time is money, as we say now. And so the idea was that if we can find a route that can transit across the Americas much quicker, and this was in the time before the Panama Canal, we can get goods to markets and be able to export and import goods fairly quickly. With melting polar ice, the idea of the Northwest Passage has kind of re-entered into kind of the geopolitical imagination. And so the possibility of a sea route from places like China and Russia to the west, or vice versa, that can bypass the Panama Canal, or Cape Horn is becoming appealing once more again. In the late 2000s, the Russian Federation kind of took a bold step in kind of claiming sovereignty, in which a submarine went down to the ocean floor near the North Pole and deposited a metal container, a metal cylinder that within it had a Russian flag, and they planted the Russian flag down at the North Pole. And they claimed that as Russian territory. Now, part of kind of their claim and kind of part of this contestation is per the tenets of the 1982 UN Convention on the Laws of the Sea, kind of a document that kind of governs the extent of EEZs and kind of maritime boundaries. A country can claim an extended exclusive economic zone or a continental shelf area that beyond its territorial waters, countries can claim more water and more kind of maritime territory than they had before. And so the possibility of increased access to wealth and geopolitical power has led several Arctic nations to lay claim to large areas of the Arctic, which has been considered international waters, right? Not just traditional Arctic nations, right? But China has become involved in this as well. Now, there is some cooperation in the Arctic, of course, right? International organizations such as the Arctic Council, alongside indigenous organizations, they do come together to discuss issues of shared importance. But one of the key questions, right, is kind of this idea of indigenous sovereignty and understanding of the Arctic, right? Because it's not just traditional Westphalian Western geopolitical powers in the North, but there's also indigenous nations that have relationships with the North. What does this look like? How does this conflict with Western conceptions of sovereignty in this space? I am not overstating or understating the importance of the North to kind of questions of security. Back during the Cold War, before the advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles, there was a series of defense lines, of center lines and radar lines across northern Canada, right? We see the Dew Line, the Mid-Canada Line, and the Pine Tree Line that were designed to be able to detect Soviet bombers coming over the North Pole to drop bombs on American and very likely Canadian cities as well. Now, I haven't really talked a lot about Indigenous peoples, and I know I have a couple of minutes left, and so I'll move fairly quickly through this, right? The North is not just a military zone, not just a securitized zone, not just a zone of opportunity, right? It is also home to Indigenous peoples such as Inuit communities. Canada has a history of trying to extend its sovereignty to the North, right? In the 1950s, during the Cold War, fears about potential Soviet and actually more accurately American presences in the Arctic led the government of Canada to move Inuit families from northern Quebec to the high Arctic archipelago back in 1953. Of course, they said that we're doing this so that we can give you better opportunities for hunting and living conditions, and they said that, you only have to stay here for 2 years, and then you'll be allowed to go back to your homes. When that time came, of course, the Canadian government said that, no, you're not allowed to go back to northern Quebec, you have to stay here. They weren't allowed to make use of any kind of governmental resources up there. And so here's a map that showed kind of the relocation of some of these peoples from northern Quebec up to the Arctic, and kind of this idea that, oh yes, you know, because they're northern peoples, right, they'll be able to adapt really quickly to conditions up there on Baffin Island, in the other northern islands. That was not the case, right? There was widespread starvation, death. What does this all mean here in the present kind of day here and now, right? And so I talked a lot about natural gas and oil. We all remember the extreme gas prices here in Victoria a couple of years ago, and kind of more recently, I remember last summer when gas kind of got over $2 a liter, right? Which was absolutely nuts. That was the point where I said, well, I'm gonna get a bus pass and stop driving to campus and get an e-bike. But we've also seen in the era of kind of climate crisis, right? We've also seen kind of widespread kind of property damage. In Canada more broadly, right, such as the flooding in the lower mainland during the atmospheric rivers back in 2021. The last point I want to kind of make here, and I purposely kind of leave this incomplete because these discussions are kind of ongoing, right, is kind of this idea that several of my presenters have kind of brought up, is kind of this idea that Canada presents itself as being like this very benign power, being very ecologically forward, right, particularly here in BC. With a lack of, without kind of recognizing or practicing self-reflexivity over the causes of the climate crisis, right? Capitalism, industrialization in the global north, the push to the global south when it became more expensive to do business, extractive industries here in the global north, the deep intrinsic connections between capital and the states, such as subsidies for pipelines and mines. You know, for example, you know, the ongoing drinking water crisis in First Nations communities. Oftentimes the refrain from the Canadian government is like, oh, well, we need more time, we have to spend more money. Even though the Trudeau government was able to spend $4 billion to pay off Kinder Morgan to buy a pipeline, for example. There was plenty of money to do that. There was plenty of money to pay RCMP, basically strike forces that are surveilling and attacking Indigenous land protectors. Indigenous and other marginalized peoples are often placed at the margins of these conversations, right? A lot of times I return to like the COP conferences, right? I think we're on COP 28 or COP 29 now, and Canada presents itself as saying like, look at what our Indigenous peoples are doing to help protect the environment and help protect the water, without there being meaningful action, meaningful consultation going on kind of here at home, right? And so kind of this idea kind of in what I call kind of a settler colonial kind of public consciousness with this increased climate change and kind of effects from climate crisis is that, well, the world is ending, right? What are we going to do? And then we turn and we put our hope in tech bro millionaires or billionaires, right? Like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. And the one thing that I kind of say is, well, why don't we ask, you know, Indigenous peoples who have lived through the end of the world multiple times, right? And kind of view how they view some of these spaces as not just areas of economic opportunity, but as home, and ask them kind of what they think about kind of climate crisis and how we can kind of secure ourselves against that. So it's kind of a whiplash kind of presentation. We kind of went through pretty quickly here, and I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A session, but thank you so much.
Great, thanks to all the presenters for giving us so much to think about. Over to the audience now to try to provoke more good thoughts. Any questions out there?
Oh, I'm not worried about the microphone. No, I had a question. Let's see. I had written down a couple of them. I had a question for Dr. Smiles.
Yes.
You mentioned the Arctic Council, which explicitly excludes security issues from its purview. Scientific, political, technological, ocean navigation, and so on, they cover everything in their ambit except security, which they have explicitly said will not be something we will do. They revisited this a few years ago and decided, no security for us. I'm curious to know if you think it might be sneaking in through the back door.
Oh, 100%. One of the things that when I teach about this, when I tell them, you know, we watch a video from the CBC where Canada explicitly says, no, we are not trying to extend our sovereignty into the Arctic Ocean in response to China and Russia, at the same time that there's increased military presence in the north, that there is an increase in kind of funding as far as icebreakers and things that would be reasonably used in order to
there you go. That could be reasonably used to extend sovereignty to the north. And so, yeah, I would say it is kind of sneaking in the back door. It may not be explicitly in the Arctic Council's kind of ambit, but it might be something that's kind of done kind of in back channels.
It just seems like they say, oh, well, security's not for us, but they end up doing it anyway. And it's going to be pointed out to them at some point that, yes, in fact, depending on how you define security, this is part of their ambit. I'm just curious how they're going to respond.
That's a really, really good question. I don't know how they will respond to it.
Okay.
Sarah, and then
Thank you. Thanks so much. So I have a couple of questions. My first is for Yvonne. I'm thinking about less so disaster-driven climate migrants in the Global South, but maybe more slow burn, right, migrants in the Global South. They don't really identify as being climate migrants. I'm wondering how people in Canada frame their understanding of forced displacement, and if they find it helpful to talk about being framed in a climate migration displacement perhaps framing. I'm also wondering, of course there's way more south-south movement than north-south, but it doesn't really take much south-north movement to induce xenophobia, right? We don't need to have anywhere near the same amount of numbers. Similarly, I'm wondering if that's the case that people are facing in Canada who are feeling displaced. They feel like you're not from our community, you're sapping our resources. And then my second question is for Shane. And when we were looking at the Polyev tweets or posts, I thought to myself, oof, what is it going to say if the call is coming from inside the House eventually? But I'm wondering, is the call for these populist activists, does it seem to them like the call is coming from the inside the House? I have a T-shirt from the Washington Embassy from 2002. It's under the Martin Chrétien era. It says, "I, Canadian flag, Canadian oil and gas," right? I maple leaf heart Canadian oil and gas. So Trudeau, I'm wondering, is Trudeau actually the change? Not necessarily. We're acting like, oh my gosh, all this populism against climate action, this is new. Is it really actually the way that we're finally engaging with it as a state that's driving, resistance to the status quo for decades, generations around this topic? Thanks.
What you said was fascinating because going back to what Will mentioned in terms of countries securitizing climate change, a place like Tuvalu has heavily securitized climate change, right? It's an existential threat. They're small in state, 5 meters above sea level. They're gonna go under, and therefore they recently signed an agreement with Australia to send 280 climate migrants. So it's the world's first bilateral climate mobility visa, right? Again, it's all of it's climate change, heavily painted as such, securitized. And of course, in return, Australia gets a say in who they partner with in terms of security and defense. Australia literally gets a veto. It's insane. And China's been doing this, and US had done this previously. But what's interesting is while the state itself has done this outwardly, people in Tuvalu don't want to move. So the conversation happening in the country, which only has 11,000 people, is that I don't know if we're going to fill those 280 visas a year. Because it'll only take 39 years to empty the country. Right? People don't actually want to leave. They live in paradise. Right? Their whole history, their whole ancestors are there. One of the most challenging conversations they have, and that is at the root of a lot of planning location, is what do you do with the graves? What do you do with the dead on these small island states? What's the respectable, cultural, social, perhaps like historical thing to do? Do you just like let them wash in the sea and that's the respectable thing to do? Or are you supposed to exhume the bones and bring them to the relocation, the new location, right? And that's something that communities across the whole world struggle with, whether it be Tuvalu or Malawi or other places. The dead are often forgotten in these conversations, right? And then maybe that's our global north bias. But anyways, all this to say, your question is interesting because while the country itself utilizes it, right, to gain stuff from other countries, the people themselves don't. And they resist. They really don't want to be refugees. They resist that term. They get really upset when it's used, right? And then people in Canada don't really relate to being displaced by climate change. And I think a lot of that is just they don't want to be, right? So, yeah, great questions. I forgot your second one, but I'll talk to you after.
Sorry, can I ask you to just I found with the echo, it was hard to follow your question.
I can use no mic. So my question is I'm wondering, you're talking about the rise of populism against this change against first environmental activists towards the government. I'm wondering, in a sense, do you think it's justified from this perspective. There's been this massive shift in government attention to climate change directly against what has been framed as the Canadian government's interest for decades.
Right. So is populism a kind of rational, interest-based response to?
I'm wondering, yeah.
Well, first of all, I actually think one of the do I have to talk? I just find the mic really. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Sorry. I think one of the most important points of intervention for critics of the fossil fuel industry is actually to separate the symbolic nationalization of that industry from what its real impacts are. So the fossil fuel industry in Canada cuts jobs whenever it can. It uses automation. It's not a job-based industry. It skirts environmental protections whenever it can. It pays off global shareholders whenever it can. And so what I guess I would resist somewhat is what populism tries to suggest or builds upon is this idea that this industry really does provide lots and lots of benefits for a large group of people. And I think that's a claim that's really important to deconstruct and really important to critique. And I think that there's work that does that. The Parklands Institute has done a lot of really good work on that, that it looks where those profits actually go. Looks at a development model which is essentially about paying off global capital to pollute northern Alberta, right? If you look at the actual benefits and where they actually go. So I think at that level, it's important to criticize that populist response, to try and separate worker from industry, right? Which has been a classic industrial corporate tactic forever. Our interests are your interests, et cetera. At another level, though, certainly the interventions from those players that I talked about, yeah, they I think do sense that a profit model, a sort of power model, if you will, is under real threat. And so they're not just doing it for fun. They're doing it to try and shore up a increasingly fragile source of power for themselves. So I think for some interests, yes, but I would be hesitant to say, well, all of Alberta is right. They really are going to get screwed under climate change. Because I think if you look in a more fine-grained way at how those benefits, the benefits from that sort of corporate extractive model are allocated, it's not at all in the ways that populists say in order to shore up their positions, if that makes sense.
That was a great presentation on the Arctic squeezed into a very short period of time. And I want to take just 1 minute to add a further nuance to it, which is that the Arctic is a very large region, and as a result, there are important differences between different parts of the Arctic. So the European Arctic, Norway, Sweden, Finland, their borders with Russia, the Barents Sea, the Norwegian Sea are right in the middle of a massive geopolitical crisis right now because of the war in Ukraine. That region has also seen an awful lot of oil and gas development. In the Canadian Arctic, we have a total of just 300 permanent Canadian Forces personnel north of 60 degrees. That's, 40% of the second largest country on Earth, 300. We have some reservists, the Canadian Rangers also, but there's no government-to-government security threat in the Canadian Arctic. That's the view of the Chief of Staff of the Canadian Forces. And similarly, there hasn't been any new extractive projects for oil and gas in the Canadian Arctic in decades. There's a very small amount of oil produced at Norman Wells on land in the Northwest Territories and a really tiny amount of natural gas at Inuvik. And that's it. Now that is perhaps because of a failure of governments to build the infrastructure necessary to support that kind of production in the past. But it's not like the Canadian Arctic is going to be opened up for oil and gas soon. So the nuance is I think, important. The Arctic is vast, and there are important differences. And so when you hear the media especially hyperventilating about contests over oil and gas in the Arctic, or the threat of a Russian military activity, well, they're speaking about the European Arctic. But again, great presentation in a short period of time. I just wanted to add that point in case someone was thinking that there was a threat here.
Thanks. I think we might have time for one more question.
I had two questions, so I'm gonna I'm gonna choose one. I would love to hear more. Maybe actually I should choose the other person because we just talked about the Arctic, and I could ask you more about that during the break. Could I ask a question to Dr. Gunster? Is that your name? No.
Sorry, me? Okay, yeah, Shane is great.
Shane. Okay, great. Thank you, Shane. I wanted to ask a little bit about the transnational aspect of this broader populist movement, specifically the populist conservative movement. And, you know, since you're a communications professor, to what extent is this discourse identical that we're seeing across? You know, whether we're thinking about the US or Canada in the Anglophone sphere, if you're looking at the Francophone sphere, if you look at some of the messaging that's happening in, you know, France, Quebec, Northern Africa, and also if you could talk to us a little bit about the agenda setting, because in political science we, you know, talk a lot about how, you know, elites are often driving the messages in the media, and so, you know, I'm curious how those messages that you're presenting to us, you know, are these things, is it just kind of a constant iterative process between, you know, the people that are the supporters of these movements and that are participating in the movements versus the elites driving these messages? Because I was really surprised to actually see what you were showing us about these, you know, the MPs, right, themselves, these specific videos coming out. But as I started to reflect a little bit more, it made sense with the importance that elites have in these messaging. So what is, you know, who's driving these things, and then to what extent are these part of this broader transnational movement that we're seeing?
Yeah, so great question, thank you. There's a lot there. I can't say that I have done a lot of extensive methodologically rigorous comparisons of different national discourses of populism, but given how populism tends to express itself through national idioms and national political cultures, I think it's fair to say that there are distinctive features of national populisms. Now, having said that, one of the like a little interesting backstory is to the development of Canadian, or sort of more, I guess, corporate-sponsored forms of populism in Canada, is that in 2015 CAP, which is the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, the main lobby organization of the oil industry, they looked to the South, the United States. They looked to the fact that they were losing pipeline wars. They were losing this battle to mobilize Canadians to come out to participate in hearings about whether having pipelines, particular projects, was a good idea. And so as part of that, as part of this, if you read industry communications at the time, they were very concerned that we're losing. Environmental activists are kicking our butts when it comes to the politics around this stuff. We need to change. We need to become more like them. And in doing that, one of the places they looked was to the United States. So CAP in 2015 brought up the API director of grassroots engagement, who actually, his name is Derek Spooner, who API actually hired away from the Nature Conservancy. So API actually looked to the environmental movement for its grassroots engagement skill building, brought him into API. He came up to CAP and essentially helped CAP develop its populist Canada's Energy Citizens program. So there's certainly parallels that one could draw, or one could draw. There's sort of common frames there. Substantively, though, I suspect that there are also as many differences as there are similarities. In other words, I don't think one can simply say these are all simply chapters of a global populist movement. I think there's a specificity to them which sometimes might get discounted if one has a sort of puppet master, which I'm not suggesting you do, but I think sometimes there can be that sense, oh, these people aren't thinking for themselves, they're just consuming memes and talking points and ideas that are manufactured elsewhere. And I'm not sure that's the case, and especially because Canada has been very effective at developing a sort of homegrown populism that it actually has exported. A lot of the more well-known, or certainly some of the more well-known populists, conservative populists in the United States, were trained, came of age, developed here. So I think there's a lot of cross-fertilization there as well.